Alright, it's time for what I watched this month, 1-minute reviews of each movie I saw in October 2020. I will be discussing the overall premise of most movies, but will not reveal any crucial ending spoilers. I'm going to do it. I'm going to watch only horror movies this October. Not necessarily one every day, but everything I do watch will be a horror movie. So let's start with The Black Cat, a 1934 film starring Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, two actors synonymous with classic horror, only a couple years after their most famous movie roles. Here they play old nemeses who meet after 15 years, but an innocent American couple gets caught in the mix as well and finds themselves in danger. The nature of the enmity between the two leads is explained just enough to pique our interest, and watching them battle for both their revenge and the lives and souls of the innocent bystanders is a lot of fun. The film plays a bit with whether or not one of them might be a hero, or whether both are as villainous as they immediately seem. The plot reveals that do happen are pretty campy and melodramatic, and large, eerie pieces are just left unexplained, but this is about atmosphere more than anything, and the film has that in spades. I would have liked maybe a little bit more backstory and a stronger connection to the Black Cat of the title, besides just being evil, but it's still very enjoyable. The Innocents is a 1961 horror film based on the Henry James novella The Turn of the Screw. Deborah Carr plays a woman who takes a governess position for two young children but begins to suspect the house where they live might be haunted. I knew absolutely nothing about The Turn of the Screw going into this. I had no idea there were ghosts in it at all. Apparently it's fairly ambiguous whether the ghosts exist or are manifestations of the protagonist's sexual repression, and various adaptations tend to lean to one side or the other. This one plays a little bit with both possibilities, but from the beginning it becomes clear that this woman is not equipped to deal with the problem of a haunting. She pulls her confident solutions out of thin air, and a speech she gives in the latter half of the film about being determined to help people even if it hurts them gave me chills. The plot of the movie, especially when she learns how the haunting affects the other occupants of the house, is very unsettling, and possibly made even more so by 1960s restrictions on how explicitly adult themes could be discussed, which means that it becomes unclear what has and has not happened. The more I sit with this movie, the more I really like it. The Conjuring stars Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga as real-life ghost hunters Ed and Lorraine Warren. This film, based on a reportedly true story, focuses on their investigation of a haunted house after a family of 7 moves into it. It's probably worth pointing out that despite being religious and believing in the supernatural myself, demon possession movies typically don't do much for me. They don't really tap into any of my deep-seated fears, though I do startle easily, so I definitely react to jump scares, or there's definitely going to be someone behind her when she looks in the mirror, but it doesn't fill me with dread. I found the scares in this one fairly by the book, and the characters of the Warrens take themselves so seriously that I couldn't. I laughed out loud at one point when, apparently at the end of a How to Hunt Demons lecture, someone asks them what their job title is. Surely that would have been shared at the beginning, but I guess they couldn't come up with a way to make it make sense and have exposition. If this is a genre of horror you find compelling to begin with, this is probably a worthy addition, but it's not the one to draw in skeptics like me. It's too cheesy for me to take seriously, but not cheesy enough to be fun. Dark and Stormy Night is a parody of 1930s and 40s horror films, written and directed by Larry Blameyer, whose 2003 B-movie parody The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra is in my top 50 films of all time. This one doesn't land quite as well for me, though it features many of the same actors and it follows the same path of just stuffing the movie chock full of styles and tropes to poke fun at. So we've got an Agatha Christie-style murder mystery and a pair of fast-talking screwball comedy reporters and the frightened and or ominous servants populating every gothic horror story. A little bit of everything. That does mean it moves along quickly enough that if one joke doesn't land, just wait a second and maybe the next one will. While I could see this one ultimately growing on me as a quotable delight, much the same way Cadavra did, the first viewing produced mostly just mild chuckles. I feel its bloatedness here in a way that I don't with Cadavra, and I find the banter between the reporters to verge on irritating. The biggest laughs for me came from tiny throwaway lines, so I'm sure there are a lot of other gems to be found, but it was a little underwhelming on the first viewing. Cemetery Man is something. Okay, so it stars Rupert Everett as a caretaker for a cemetery where the dead come back to life after 7 days, and he and his assistant have to kill them again. And Rupert Everett is also trying to find love, and eventually he starts murdering people, maybe? This is a weird, surreal film with all these little touches of bizarre black comedy, and I just did not grasp how this all came together or what the meaning of it was supposed to be. At first it comes across as just a quirky horror comedy, but then it gets more and more surreal as it goes on. At one point I wondered if maybe it was all in his mind, or if it was trying to make some big symbolic point about life and death, and the ending did not help solidify that one way or the other for me. It's also a very gross movie, and I don't mean gore. I mean people are like always drooling and puking, and that stuff gets to me more than basically anything else I can think of. I don't think I got anything out of this. It's just bizarre and creepy and icky for no reason. I can't recommend this one to anybody. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is an adaptation of the classic book, this time directed by and starring Kenneth Branagh. It tells the familiar story of mad scientist Victor Frankenstein's experiments with life and death, which successfully create a living creature who he then disavows as an abomination, and the creature in its anger and loneliness wreaks havoc. I really love Branagh as a film director because he turns every film, no matter the original genre, into a grandiose Greek tragedy, and I love it. There is no subtlety in this film, which apparently really angered the screenwriter, but I found it captivating, especially as someone already very familiar with the original story. Characters scream and collapse and shake their fists at the heavens and rip out other characters' hearts and set themselves on fire, and I love every minute of it. I really have to lean away from realism and into the aesthetic of a Branagh film to get the most out of it, but when I do, oh goodness is it a reward. This film is most definitely not for everybody, but it is very much for somebody, and that somebody is me. Christine is based on a Stephen King book about a teenager who buys a car that turns out to be an evil murder car. The car is named Christine, and she becomes obsessed with the teenager who buys her and fixes her up, and she attempts to kill both people who hurt him and people who get close to him out of jealousy. John Carpenter directs this adaptation, and it's a pretty good fit. While on the surface, Murder Car sounds like a fun, silly horror movie premise, where the film really gets scare mileage is in the character development of Arnie, Christine's owner. One minute he's the mild-mannered nerd constantly getting beaten up, and the next he is all about letting his car take lethal revenge on his enemies and cracking jokes about it afterwards. His mutual friends are worried that the car is the cause of this. One even says at one point, "I don't think he's Arnie anymore," but we never see that change in progress, and I find it just as likely that all this rage has been simmering below the surface, and just as soon as he got enough power to make his revenge fantasy come true, he was happy to take it. That hits close to home in a way Murder Car never could, and that definitely brings this deeper, truer fear to the front. Cam is a 2018 Netflix movie about Alice, a cam girl who performs under the pseudonym Lola. One day she discovers some other person who looks exactly like her has stolen her account and is doing shows pretending to be her, and nobody believes it isn't her. It's a weird, creepy story that may very well have some logical loopholes, but ultimately I didn't care because this is one of the most engaging movies I've seen in a long time. I attribute that to a combination of the writing and the acting. Screenwriter Issa Mazzei did work as a cam girl. The scene where Alice goes to the police for help, only to have them ask her with a sleazy grin, "So what's the weirdest thing you ever did on camera?" is apparently taken pretty directly from Mazzei's experience. It's a world I know very little about, but I can feel the authenticity in the writing. And Madeline Brewer as Alice is tremendously compelling. She plays a smart, independent woman who feels like her whole life is inexplicably unraveling. The ending is, again, perhaps logically confusing, but for once I didn't care because it was riveting to watch. This is definitely a little gem of a horror flick, and check it out. Kill List is a confusing horror movie, centered around a hired assassin returning to work after an extended break. I won't give any more plot details than that, partly for spoiler reasons. I'm not even sure I can reveal the horror subgenre without spoiling its ending, but partly because not much more than that is actually clear. It's a film that plays on creepy atmosphere more than anything. It reminds me a bit of Denis Villeneuve's Enemy, which I watched recently and found frustrating in its being almost a straightforward narrative and then abruptly very much not. The creepy atmosphere here does have some effective moments. There's one brief scene involving the use of a drum beat that just completely paralyzed me in fear, which was the first movie this month to do that and was kind of a delicious cathartic moment. But I think the movie is relying on more moments like that, of its ending images evoking pure terror to the point where I am affected rather than distracted by trying to figure out what's actually happening at this point in the story. Kill List made a lot of my friends' best of 2011 lists, so I had high hopes for it going in, but aside from that one very effective moment, it left me cold. Deep Red is a giallo film by Dario Argento about a man who witnesses a woman's murder and finds the killer is stalking him too, so he sets out to find them. I've only seen one other Argento film, Suspiria, but the hallmarks of his filmmaking are distinctive enough that they're easily recognizable here. Bold colors, over-the-top violence and gore, a dramatic score. There's a fascinating musical choice made every time we see another murder happen, where it flips from an ominous score to a much higher energy, much more exciting one. And that scoring decision, along with the fact that we see the murders committed from the killer's point of view, thus obscuring their identity, it puts us unsettlingly in this unknown murderer's shoes and sets up these dramatically violent moments as a sort of adrenaline rush. Giallo is a horror subgenre I don't instantly connect with, but by the end of this one, I'd mostly come around on it. It helped that the story was concrete enough that the stylistic choices felt like an enhancement rather than a distraction. I don't know that I'll revisit this one anytime soon, but I'm glad I got to see it. Critters is a sci-fi horror comedy about a bunch of alien monsters who escape their captivity and make their way to Earth, terrorizing the countryside. The film focuses on the family who live on the farm the critters find, as well as the alien bounty hunters sent to hunt down the creatures. This is definitely more comedy than horror, although something about those creatures rolling along after their prey like tiny tumbleweeds is actually pretty creepy. I definitely laughed a lot more than I expected to. While it's not usually laugh-out-loud funny, there was just a consistently lighthearted tone to this that worked for me pretty much throughout, and I kept finding individual moments amusing. It isn't afraid to lean into absurdity, especially when it comes to the scenes with the bounty hunters. It's obvious how low budget this is and how much they're trying to hide that. The little we do see of the creature design is pretty disappointing. This is one of those movies that might actually benefit from a remake. I'd love to see those creatures turned into something more ominous now that that tech is more widely available, and it wouldn't hurt them to add in some stronger character development while they're at it. Life After Beth is a horror romance comedy about a high school student whose girlfriend breaks up with him and then dies in a tragic accident. But then she comes back to life with no memory of her death, and he jumps at the chance to resume their relationship, even with her strange new quirks. Without giving too much away, I'll just say the story escalates from there. I had so much fun with this movie. I laughed out loud a lot, especially as the story spiraled beyond the initial two. I also like how the relationship between those two was in crisis even before she died. The reason it's not working now isn't even necessarily because she's undead now, but because their relationship never worked, and that's just exacerbated now. There are a lot of great side characters here too, from the protagonist's gun-obsessed older brother, to an exceptionally awkward Anna Kendrick, to Beth's mom, who just keeps taking pictures to commemorate her resurrection. It's a clever and entertaining entry in a very oversaturated genre, and I thought it was a lot of fun to watch. Definitely recommend. The Keep is a horror movie directed by Michael Mann about a mysterious keep the Nazis have occupied in Romania. The Nazi soldiers keep mysteriously dying, so they bring in a Jewish scholar to try and solve the mystery. The plot is just barely clinging together here. Apparently Mann ran into a lot of shooting difficulties, and then his visual effects supervisor died 2 weeks into post-production, and then he had to cut down his 210-minute movie to 2 hours, which the studio then cut down to 90 minutes, and you can see the many holes that resulted. That being said, it is undeniably atmospheric. You can almost lean into the bare-bones plot as missing pieces not because it had been brutally chopped up, but because it's an unearthly tale we'll never fully understand. And the editing makes it almost impossible to tell where rooms in the keep are relative to each other, and while on one hand that's an obvious editing error, on the other it definitely builds the unease and tension, much more than the incessant smoke. Apparently the film has a small cult following, and I totally get why. It's kind of captivating in all its messiness. The Orphanage is a Spanish-language horror film about a woman who buys the orphanage where she grew up, and she, her husband, and her son intend to turn it into a home for special needs children. But then her son disappears, and she begins to suspect his imaginary friends might not be so imaginary. This was produced by Guillermo del Toro, and I get big Del Toro vibes from it, coming in strong with both the scares and the emotionally powerful ending. On the surface, it's a pretty standard story, but the scary moments are low on jump scares and heavy on ominous atmosphere, and it's all structured impeccably. At one point, I turned to my husband and said, "I don't think I can watch this part, it's too creepy." But the overarching narrative of the orphanage's history and how our protagonist fits into it is what hit me most. I was in tears by the end of the movie, and it's been a little while since a movie hit me quite that hard emotionally. It reminded me a bit of both The Innocents and The Conjuring, two other horrors from this October, but this is scarier and more powerful than either of them. If you liked Pan's Labyrinth or The Devil's Backbone, this film is a great next choice. Hush is a home invasion movie featuring a deaf-mute woman as the protagonist. That's about it when it comes to plot. I am on a roll with my October horror movies because this is another extremely solid one. It draws obvious comparisons to Wait Until Dark, another movie about a woman with a disability being stalked in her home, but this one is even more narrowly focused, as it all happens over the course of a single evening with only one notable time jump. It does a stellar job of placing us inside our protagonist's mind as she explores every option she has, from trying to reason with her stalker, to finding her murdered friend's phone, to distracting him with a flare and then running, and as her options narrow, we feel her claustrophobia and panic, and it's so easy to get sucked into that along with her. At one moment, when she had a small victory, I audibly yelped in excitement. For the most part, she makes smart choices the audience can ride along with, though I'll never understand why she didn't throw something heavy at his head when she was on the roof, and those early scenes when he's toying with her while she doesn't know he's there is one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen on screen. Definitely worth a watch. The Phantom of the Opera is one of my all-time favorite stories, particularly the original book and the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. This 1943 version tells loosely the same story, about a disfigured madman who lives in the Paris Opera House and becomes obsessed with a young singer named Christine. This is an interesting take on the character in that he seems just like a regular quote-unquote loser who happens to be hiding out in the opera house. He doesn't have money or intelligence or remarkable musical prowess or possible supernatural abilities. He just managed to steal a master key and a prop mask, and now he can get in anywhere. And after that descent into madness, he's barely in it. And the story switches to being maybe about Christine, maybe about the police trying to solve the murders, but none of them really feel like the film's central character either. I would maybe argue that this film's protagonist is opera itself. We get 5 or 6 full-length opera numbers. I feel like it's gotta be about a third of the film's runtime. The tone of the film overall is kinda messy and weird, but it does preserve some of the horror of the character, and I guess if you're in the mood to listen to opera for half an hour, here it is. The Wolfman tells the story of a man who returns to the home he left years ago to solve his brother's murder. As the title indicates, there may be werewolves involved. This is pretty dumb. It's clearly going for an eerie gothic vibe, but like so many movies that try to emulate that look, it just ends up looking gloomy. And the special effects in this just don't work. The transformations are never scary, so much as just cartoonishly gross, and the final image of the werewolf fully transformed is never a compellingly scary look. And on top of that, we have some really bad writing. Lots of monologuing, abrupt changes of topic, a romance that never even comes close to earning its place as a dramatic plot point in the movie's climax. The list goes on. And on top of all this, it's just boring. It's a dull, ugly-looking movie that doesn't do a thing to explore any of the interesting questions that monster movies can play with. This movie has no core, no heart, no storytelling motivation propelling it forward. It feels just slapped together because, people like werewolves. A really disappointing watch. Re-Animator is based on the stories of H.P. Lovecraft and centers on Herbert West, a medical student who has found a way to reanimate the dead. Of course, things go very wrong, but he is determined to do whatever he needs to do to solidify his research and cement his name in history as a pioneer. This is such a delightfully cheesy film, with all these extravagantly gory special effects functioning perfectly as both horrifying and absurd. And they just get more and more outlandish as the story goes on. The segments toward the end, where a head on a tray and his lumbering severed body are the main villains, is an especially great combo of grotesque and hilarious. Jeffrey Combs as West turns in a very fun performance, really milking his character's obsession for all it's worth. The rest of the characters are pretty bland, aside from maybe the primary antagonist, but they're just there to be audience inserts and foils for West's mad plans anyway, so they fulfill their purposes. And the effects are just so much fun to watch. Definitely worth seeing if you like gory B-movies. It is not at all disappointing as far as that goes. Train to Busan is a Korean horror movie about a group of passengers on, a train to Busan when a zombie uprising starts. One infected woman makes it onto the train and it spreads, and the story centers on the passengers' attempts to survive. I find these zombies absolutely terrifying. They come to life with a viscerally unpleasant bone-cracking sound, and their joints twist into unnatural-looking positions, and the speed and fury with which they charge at their victims only adds to that terror. It's not the first film to do fast zombies, but I think it does do them particularly well. The characters are also frequently intelligent, coming up with smart ways to survive long enough to get from point A to point B. The movie has a pretty powerful emotional center overall too, although when it falls hard, with a couple of almost cringe-worthy sentimental moments. But these are short-lived missteps, and the film definitely regains its footing and ends on a strong note. This and other disease-themed movies certainly hit differently in 2020 than they would have in 2016, so I found myself reacting very strongly to the message of camaraderie being risky and necessary for survival. Wes Craven's New Nightmare is 1994's entry into the Nightmare on Elm Street series. It's a fun departure from the series in that it's a meta-movie about Heather Langenkamp, the actress who played the first movie's sole survivor. Wes Craven, Robert Englund, and other real-life movie people involved in the series also appear as themselves. In this version, Freddy is a real-life evil that can be contained in movies for a short time, so now they have to make another movie to contain him again. Unfortunately, it's more fun as a concept than it is as an actual movie. The film is less than 2 hours, but it drags, and it's much less clear than the first movie, the only other one I've seen in the franchise, exactly what our central character is supposed to do to defeat Freddy. Most of the movie seems to be relying on the various sequences of creepy dream deaths to carry the movie, and one or two of those are pretty effective, but they frequently feel isolated or unconnected from the larger narrative, like we're just waiting to fulfill our quota of creepy interactions before we could actually have a final showdown. It's a great idea for a sequel or reboot, but it didn't sell me on the series. Event Horizon is a sci-fi horror film about a crew that goes to investigate a spaceship that mysteriously vanished several years ago and has now just as mysteriously reappeared. Once on the ship, things go wrong, everyone gets trapped, and the crew members start to hallucinate people from their past. This is such a strange movie, because on one hand, you get the sense that it wants to be Solaris, prompting big philosophical questions about guilt and the past and alternate dimensions, or maybe Alien, a dark edge-of-your-seat survival thriller, but it also has so many moments that are shot and edited and sound designed so comedically that it undercuts both the attempted thoughtfulness and the attempted dramatic tension, and it keeps landing in the campy B-movie circle, particularly in the final third. It's hard to tell what anyone was actually going for in the end with this, but I ultimately kind of enjoyed the goofiness of it, especially Sam Neill's performance toward the movie's ending. It's a mess, but kind of an entertaining one, but you just can't take it quite as seriously as the filmmakers maybe hoped you would. Velvet Buzzsaw is a Netflix horror movie set in the art gallery world. A woman working at one of the art galleries finds one of her neighbors dead and his apartment full of paintings, which she then steals and brings to her own gallery. He's hailed as a master and is an explosive posthumous success, but then people who come into contact with his work start mysteriously dying. This is a strange, sterile movie where every character has 3 layers of cool detachment, and that makes these paintings that murder people feel like the most alive thing in the movie. The horror itself spirals a little too quickly for my taste, but there are some really great pieces, including a very dramatically satisfying death in the movie's final moments. And more than that, I very much enjoyed observing this world, and the ins and the outs and the drama between competing galleries trying to lure artists to them, and the art critic constantly being solicited to write favorable or unfavorable reviews. It's a really fun setting for the story. It's not perfect by far, but you can see the seeds of something great hiding in here, and it's definitely one of the more unique movies I've seen this month. Onibaba is a Japanese horror film about 2 women struggling to survive during a civil war. A former soldier from their village returns, and the younger woman begins a relationship with him, which the older woman doesn't approve of, and things get intense. This is a very slow build-up to a nicely creepy ending 20 minutes or so, and I'm not sure the payoff was quite worth it for me. I didn't particularly care about any of the characters, and conceptually it doesn't really kick off for me until at least halfway through, if not more. It does have a very atmospheric score, which I really appreciated. It creates a very uneasy tone, even when nothing much is happening. And it does look like there's a fair amount of social and political commentary happening throughout this that I just didn't have the context to fully appreciate, aside from some general anti-war sentiments. Apparently this director was from Hiroshima and was known for addressing the bombing of Hiroshima in his films. I wish the whole thing was condensed down to like a 20 or 30 minute short, but as it is, I found my attention wandering frequently through most of the movie. When the Lights Went Out is about a family who moves into a new house only to learn that it is haunted. This is not at all a new premise. It's not even the first movie with this plot that I've watched this month, so the question is, does it do anything different with it? Well, almost. Early on, the family reveals to the media that they have a ghost, and they start getting tourists who want to see the ghost house, and that seems like a really interesting route for a haunted house movie to go, and then that entire plotline just gets dropped. And in fact, a scene or two later, the family suddenly having to reconvince each other that their home is haunted. This happens a lot in this movie. It sets up an intriguing conceit for the next part of the story, which then vanishes, like it never happened at all. It's one of the most frustrating movies I've seen recently, because it keeps turning the corner towards something new and original, and then it not only chickens out, but continually retcons itself. Like the scriptwriter decided to delete that scene from the final script and wrote on without it, but then the director filmed it anyway. As a result, it ends up being just a strange, tangled mess that goes back to the same bland tropes over and over again without any narrative consistency. When a Stranger Calls tells the story of a babysitter whose two charges are murdered while she's babysitting. The killer is caught and institutionalized, but 7 years later he escapes and comes back to stalk her. I say it's the babysitter's story, but it really isn't. While her pieces of the story are by far the most compelling, she's actually only in the first 30 and last 15 or so of the movie. The middle hour is a tedious play-by-play of the murderer's trek through the city and the private detective trying to find him, and those character arcs are very shoddy. At one point, the detective abruptly announces he's going to kill the guy because, as he says, the closer I get to this guy, the more he gets to me. I don't know. Gotta love a protagonist who's like, this person bugs me, guess I have no choice but to murder him. And the whole movie is kind of like that, with characters making jumps to big decisions based on nothing tangible. Nothing in the movie ever measures up to that first half hour, which is so well executed and feels like an internet creepypasta in the simplicity of its horror. After that, it's a steep drop downhill with a sloppy attempt at recapturing those early scares at the end.